This session has 3 objectives, which is to explain the variation in students who are deaf and hard of hearing from linguistically diverse families. I'm also going to outline some of the challenges these students face and add some steps that teachers can take to improve outcomes for these students. One of the things that I feel is important to understand is that these students have multiple languages and multiple cultures. They and their families live a multilingual existence. So there's American culture, there's American deaf culture, there's the family culture of origin, and then the US culture of their ethnic group, which can vary from the culture in their country. So as a result, the families live a multilingual and multicultural experience. Now, there's been some change in terminology this year. I don't know why, but the US Department of Education changed the term English language learner to English learner, from ELL to EL, and that showed up this year. So you may see some references to ELL and some to EL. It may be inconsistent. So I'm going to right now give you services for students who are English learners come under Title III in the US Department of Education. And this is their definition. Not born in the United States and or whose native language is other than English, and lack of English proficiency is a barrier to learning in the classroom when the instruction's in English, and also a barrier to meeting state assessment levels of proficiency. This is the most recent definition. Now, to clarify and confuse things, we have we have a number of programs for the deaf, primarily programs that define themselves as bilingual ASL English programs that have been using the label ELL for their deaf students. So in 2011, the Department of Education sent a letter out to these programs clarifying that in general, deaf students cannot be categorized as English language learners simply because they rely on ASL. But they have to be from a background, primarily a family that uses another language, or they're an immigrant. Just to explain this briefly, in these programs that are bilingual ASL English programs, the instruction is delivered in ASL and English, and the students are all on a sort of a level playing field as far as language goes. But if a student comes in, a deaf and hard of hearing student comes into that program and comes in from another country, or they come from a home that uses another language, they may be behind the other students in that school. So the Department of Education says that they are to receive services to support their learning English so that they can participate in the instruction in that environment, just like a hearing student who comes in without English proficiency. So the deaf students who enter school here when they're 2.5 or 3, by the time, a few years later, say in 2nd grade, if a student joins them who's never been exposed to those languages, that student is not starting at the same place. And the US Department of Education says the school is obligated to provide support, instruction, doesn't define what it has to look like, but is obligated to provide support so that those students can gain the language skills that they need to participate in the classroom. And that's different from the whole question of being dominant in ASL. And I could go on and on, but I'm not going to. This term, children of immigration, I'm not speaking exclusively of immigrant students, but they do form a large part of the group that I'm talking about. So families who speak languages other than English, the majority of those families are immigrants and people who migrate from Puerto Rico who are US citizens, but Spanish is the primary language and the official language of the island, and also includes Native American and Alaskan Natives. These are all groups that are categorized as, are in the general EL population. Suarez Orozco and Suarez Orozco came up with this term, children of immigration, which reflects children who they may have been born outside the US or their parents may have been born outside of the US, but reflects the fact that this is a family that is an immigrant family regardless of whether the children were born in or out of the US. And often the families are a mix of children born here and children born outside, or the parents, it may be one US born, one born outside. So this term, children of immigration, is very useful. I forgot to explain this acronym. CLD is an acronym for culturally and linguistically diverse, and it's very common in the education literature, and in some states they use that term. In the United States, Latinos are the largest minority group in the US and in deaf education. Virginia, the most recent statistics are about 2 years old, is one of 18 states that has between 6 and 9.9% immigrant students, or EL, English language students in public schools. And here's a map, and you see the darker colors are the states with the highest number of English learners. And the lightest color states have the lowest number, and Virginia is in the second category of the second highest. I presume from my exposure to local demographics that the majority of those students live in Northern Virginia, but of course not exclusively. I'm showing you the 2000 and 2010 statistics. There are more recent statistics, and I had a conversation with Anne about this, but they are one hot mess. And in fact, I'm supposed to be meeting with the director of Gallaudet Research Institute about this, because it shows a drop of about 40% in the number of deaf and hard of hearing children nationally, and declining numbers of diverse children, which contradicts every other source of data you look at. Even if you look at states like California and Texas, where they can, you look at the child find statistics, you look at the statistics of English learners, and you know that the recent statistics from Gallaudet are just off. I know that there are, I can't remember, there was a state, I know Maine, it said they only had 3 deaf children in the entire state of Maine. I know that that's not true. That's one extreme example, but there were other states where they gave very small numbers, and I'm kind of like, that's just not accurate. So that's why I'm using these numbers. And you cannot go to the Gallaudet website because, thanks to me, they've pulled down all the surveys. And there's some people in the room who know me, so I I may be seen as a troublemaker, but that was not how this started out. It was just asking questions. So we'll see what happens from this point. So that's a long introduction to why you're seeing statistics from 2010. You can see the number of students that are racially and ethnically diverse is approaching half of the population. And then here's a breakdown of other categories. Over 30% are Latino. Almost 22% are from Spanish-speaking homes. Over 25% of all deaf and hard of hearing students have spoken languages other than English, Spanish, or ASL in the home. No, that should be English other than English. It includes Spanish. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to fix that before I post it for you. And almost 23% are categorized as English learners under No Child Left Behind, which is a very important statistic. And I've been doing this work for about 28 years, and I keep asking myself, how large do these numbers have to get before we do more? I come from the Northeast. I'm a New Englander, and going back to the late 70s, we had programs focusing on Latino deaf students. There was a grant in New York State, and then the same group got a federal grant to provide training and services. And that was 1978. So that's, I don't know, you do the math, 37 years ago. Now I want to describe, I gave you the statistics to set up the context, because people still ask, what's the big deal? And that's why you need the numbers. And you also need the numbers because that's how you get funding and that's how you get services. That's why it's so important, in my opinion, to have correct numbers. So now I'm going to describe some of the variations, and believe me, they're much more complex than what I'm presenting, but I want to give you at least a framework for variations in deaf and hard of hearing children from linguistically diverse families. So first, if we look at those students who were born in the US, their experiences are usually different from students whose parents are fluent in English, because those parents are more likely to be familiar with the American education system. But the students whose parents are not fluent in English have a different experience. So already we have a distinction there. Now, if we talk about those students who are foreign born, sometimes they have a literacy skill in another language. I'll add that most of the time is overlooked. They may know another sign language. Most of the time that's overlooked. They may have interrupted schooling, and I'll explain that a little later. And there's a term underschooled, which refers to those students who haven't had consistent education from the time they were eligible to enter school. And many of them haven't had hearing aids, any kinds of auditory or speech help. And you know, when you're talking about students who are hard of hearing, they would be at a disadvantage compared to their peers, US-born peers, who've had that kind of input from an early age. So when we talk about school, what happens in school, there's some differences for these students from their peers. Those who were born in the US, we have issues of early screening, hearing loss screening. The Identification is often delayed because of something called loss to follow-up. Are there people here who are familiar with that term, loss to follow-up? Okay. That, I will explain that a little later, I think. Here, let me just check. I may be getting confused with my presentation on families, that's why. Well, I will, basically that means that the babies are screened in the hospital and the families don't come back. Families often have difficulty accessing services because of the language differences. And then there are other factors such as financial instability, varying family needs, change of jobs, mobility, etc. So these are things that are often different from their other deaf and hard of hearing peers. Not 100%, but often. So if we look at those students who are born outside the US, some of the differences are they may have limited formal education, and these are some of the reasons that happens. There's no schooling or little schooling for deaf and hard of hearing students. For example, in many Latin American countries, there may not be deaf education. They may have special education centers where all students with special educational needs attend those centers, including deaf and hard of hearing children, and they're often in the same classroom, and they may or they may not have an interpreter. There's also another reason this impacts all students. It's one of the main reasons that hearing immigrant students have limited formal education or interrupted schooling because of civil unrest, war, natural disasters, such as in the 80s there were huge earthquakes in Honduras and other parts of Central America. Those kinds of events can disrupt education for long periods of time. Often the families don't have the educational records, the kind of records that we look for their students. Sometimes also one parent or both parents may come to the United States before the children come, and the child is left behind in the care of a family member, often a grandmother or an aunt. And when the child arrives and the parent comes into the school, and the school starts asking a lot of questions about the child's education, the parent may not have that information, but in many cultures, the norm would be you want to be cooperative, you want to save face, and so you may give an answer that maybe you're not sure, but you'll say something. There was an experience where we had two older boys come from the Dominican Republic in Boston, and they were like 18 and 19, and the mother said they had never gone to school. Well, we had 9 kids from the same town in our school. We had more kids from that town in the Dominican Republic than we had from any neighborhood in Boston. And so I said, well, the other kids will know if they went to school. So I had to get special permission to bring these high school boys to the cafeteria when the elementary kids were eating. And of course those kids were saying, we know them, we went to school with them, blah, 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 blah. The school was reluctant to include that in their formal record, but I was satisfied that, yes, they had gone to school in this town. I knew this town had a school for the deaf, because it's a town in the Dominican Republic with a very high incidence of deafness. Obviously, we had 9 kids in our school from that town. So there's other differences related to language. Some of these students know the sign language of their home country. Sometimes they have some spoken or written language skills. But many times, because we don't have anyone who can assess that, we may completely overlook it, or I would say ignore it. Well, we can't assess it, so we're not going to pay attention to it. As far as literacy, many of these students have some kind of education, even if it's not the best, and their skills may range from pre-literate to almost age-appropriate reading skills. Or they may read, for example, you get a student who's 14 who may read at the same level in Spanish as 14-year-old deaf students we have, which is probably not at an 8th or 9th grade level, but it's comparable. There are ways, just keeping that in mind is important, because we can't rule out that they know nothing about print. Often, if you observe these students, you'll know they obviously know something about print, because they know they can pick up a pencil, they can write from left to right, they know how to pick up a book, turn pages, etc. These are the kind of pre-literate print concepts that are important. So we shouldn't see them as an empty vessel. So what are some of the needs of these students? I will expand on each one of these points. Early access to service and education, our understanding of the language issues for the student and family, appropriate assessment, culturally responsive school environments, and culturally responsive teaching and curriculum. So the first group of students I mentioned, the largest, actually the largest minority group in deaf education are Latino deaf and hard of hearing students. So they were the first to get attention back in the 70s, 40 years ago. And they were formally recognized by CEASD, which is the Conference of Educational Administrators of Schools for the Deaf. It used to be administrators serving the deaf, but they changed it to administrators of schools for the deaf. 34 years ago, they passed a resolution saying we need more Latino and diverse professionals, curriculum instructional materials that recognize their culture and language, and better interpreter services for the families. So what have we done since 1981? One area of growth that has really expanded tremendously in the past few years are trilingual interpreting services. There's a National Center on Interpreting Education, which has trilingual interpreting resources. When I post this PowerPoint, these links will all help you to lead you to these resources. VRS also has trilingual services. Professionals, we haven't done that well. There's been a small increase, but there's still not a lot. And there are very, very few trilingual and multilingual professionals in deaf education. When you consider just Spanish, which is the largest language group, and I would say for English speakers, it's much more attainable a goal to learn Spanish than to learn Vietnamese or Arabic. We still don't have many professionals who have those language skills. And there's almost nothing that's been done regarding curriculum and instructional materials. There have been a couple little projects here and there, but very little. I'm going to then look at early access and delayed service delivery, which is a big issue with this population. Some of the reasons they receive services later: loss to follow-up, which in 2013 was 32% of screened babies. And interesting, I'll add a note. Some people have hypothesized that immigrant families are more likely to be loss to follow-up, but some states have reported that actually in some states those aren't the largest numbers. So it could vary from area to area. Late identification. If we're talking about children who move here from another country, a few years ago with some colleagues from CDC, we did a survey of early infant screening in Latin American countries, and we found it varied widely. There were countries that were almost ahead of the United States, for example, Brazil, but that would be in the largest cities. There were countries where we couldn't even identify anyone who was involved in infant screening. Not to say it didn't exist, but for example, countries like Bolivia, we don't know. There were other countries where they were making progress, but it was still not at the rate of the United States. So if we get students who were born in other countries, one of the reasons for later identification is that the infant screening is not at the level it is in the United States, which was the motivation for us doing this study. And there's lack of access to early intervention services, sometimes geographical. If families are living in rural areas, if families are living in certain neighborhoods without good transportation. Sometimes the barriers are linguistic, lack of service providers who speak their language, or a lack of interpreters. And then another reason is family mobility, why children don't get these early access, delayed service delivery. Families move, we lose track of them. It takes a while for another agency to identify this child and the child's needs. So I did explain this, but one of the reasons for loss to follow-up is that parents may not understand the meaning of the screening or what they're supposed to do next. Unless it's explained face-to-face in person in their own language, it's less likely that they're going to really understand completely what this is all about. You can't just give them a brochure. That's not effective. We have a lot of data that shows that's not effective. It's culturally unfamiliar, and it's just not the way to do it. One of the things that's hard to understand for any parent is the impact of hearing loss on language development. And that's just as true for linguistically diverse parents. And understandings of disability across culture are complex, and they may be different from our own. EDI, which many of you may be familiar with, the early hearing detection and intervention. I'm really bad at acronyms. There is a committee, a diversity committee that works through CDC, and we've been working on creating original materials in Spanish, not translated. So there's a brochure that we created a few years ago. Well, it's more like a little booklet, and I'll make sure to link to that when I post this. And right now we're working on a video which is in Spanish, which includes several families talking about their process from infant screening to through early intervention, directly from families who are Spanish speaking. So the reason we create original materials is that we feel you're translating something that may not be culturally match the families. The language enough may not be sufficient.